Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. This is part 2 of our story of Sweden's Age of Liberty. When we left Sweden, the country had spent 2 decades recovering from the collapse of its empire. The monarchy had been restrained, the Riksdag had become powerful, and for a while, Sweden had something it desperately needed: peace. But peace changes things. It changes the economy, it changes politics, and perhaps most importantly, it changes memory. The people who remembered the Great Northern War were getting older. A new generation was coming of age. And they remembered the Swedish Empire very differently. They remembered the victories, they remembered the glory, but they hadn't lived through the cost. And now that memory was about to become political. So let's pick up where we left off. Why shouldn't Sweden be great again? And this is where things get interesting, because the problem with peace is that eventually people forget why they need it. 20 years can change a country. The men who had fought in the Great Northern War were getting older, their children were now adults, and a new generation was entering Swedish politics that had inherited the stories of the empire without experiencing the reality of it. They had heard about Gustavus Adolphus. They had heard about Charles X Gustav crossing the frozen Danish belts. They had heard about Narva. They had heard about Charles XII. But they hadn't stood on a battlefield. They hadn't watched a Swedish army disappear. They hadn't waited for a letter from a son who would never come home. To them, the empire was becoming something very different. A memory. And memories have a strange habit of editing themselves. The victories stay, the suffering fades, the empty farms disappear, the widows disappear, the fear disappears. What remains is the story of how glorious Sweden once was. And eventually that story became political. 2 factions began dominating the Riksdag, the hats and the caps. And I have to admit, those names don't exactly sound threatening. They represented 2 very different ideas about where Sweden should go next. The caps were broadly associated with caution. They wanted to protect the recovery Sweden had made, keep spending under control, avoid another disastrous war, let trade and the economy strengthen. The hats had a very different vision. They believed Sweden had become too cautious, too passive, too willing to accept the losses of the Great Northern War. They wanted Sweden to become a major power again, and that meant looking beyond Sweden's borders, especially towards Russia. This is where the argument becomes much more interesting than simply one side wanted war and the other wanted peace, because both sides thought they were acting in Sweden's best interests. The caps looked at the last 20 years and saw a warning. The hats looked at the same history and saw unfinished business. And if you think about it, that's an almost impossible argument to settle. What does the past actually mean? Does it tell you what not to do again, or does it remind you of what you're capable of? The answer depends partly on which parts you remember. And Sweden's younger political generation was remembering the victories. The stories of Swedish military greatness were still there, but the emotional memory of what those victories had cost was beginning to disappear. And once that happened, the old dream became easier to sell. France was interested in bringing Sweden back into the European balance of power. There was money available, there were promises of support, and Russia was growing stronger. To the hats, that looked like an opportunity. If Sweden was ever going to recover its position, perhaps this was the moment. The question was no longer whether Sweden could afford another war. The question became whether Sweden could afford not to take the opportunity. And that's a dangerous question, because once you start thinking that way, almost any risk can be made to sound necessary. A stronger Russia, a reason to act. A diplomatic promise from France, a reason to act. A lost province, a reason to act. A chance to restore national pride, certainly a reason to act. The memory of the Great Northern War had warned one generation away from war, but the next generation, the same history was becoming an argument for war. And by the late 1730s, the Hats had gained enough influence to turn that argument into policy. Sweden was about to test whether the lessons of the Great Northern War had actually been learned or merely forgotten. By the late 1730s, the Hats had the political influence they needed. Now they had to prove their argument. They believed Russia was vulnerable, they believed France would support them, and they believed Sweden had been too cautious for too long. The opportunity was there, or at least that's how it looked from Stockholm. And this is where I think it's worth stopping for a moment, because from a distance, the decision to go to war can look insane. Sweden had only recently recovered from the last disaster. The country was still nowhere near the power it had been under Charles XII. Russia was stronger. And yet the Hats weren't necessarily behaving irrationally by the standards of their time. They believed they saw an opening, and they believed Russia could be defeated. And they believed if Sweden didn't act, the opportunity might disappear. And that's how wars often begin. Not with someone saying, let's make a terrible decision, but with someone saying, this might be our last chance. So in 1741, Sweden went to war with Russia. And almost immediately, the reality was very different from the plan. The army wasn't ready. Supplies were inadequate. Command was confused. The Swedish support the Hats had counted on didn't materialize the way they had expected. And the Swedish military machine that had once terrified Europe was no longer the machine it had been. The war became a disaster, and in 1742, the Swedish army in Finland surrendered at Helsinki. Now, think about the irony. A generation earlier, Sweden had gone to war because it believed it could recover what it had lost. Now, another war with Russia had produced another defeat, and Sweden had lost even more territory in Finland. The dream had not returned. It had become smaller again. But there's something important here. The failure wasn't simply that the Hats had made a bad military decision. It exposed something much deeper. Sweden had changed. The country that had once been able to sustain an enormous military empire was gone. The population wasn't large enough. The resources weren't there. The geopolitical situation had changed. Russia was no longer the opponent Sweden had defeated at Narva. It was becoming one of Europe's major powers. The world had moved on. Sweden was still trying to catch up with the version of itself that no longer existed. And perhaps that's one of the hardest things for a nation to accept. Sometimes you don't lose because you weren't brave enough. Sometimes you lose because the world changed and you didn't. The war finally ended in 1743, and Sweden had to face the question it had been avoiding. If the empire wasn't coming back, then what was Sweden going to become? Because there was now evidence on both sides. The Caps could point to the Great Northern War and say, "We told you so." The Hats had tried to restore Sweden's position and failed, but something else had been happening while all of this political fighting was going on. Sweden had begun building a different kind of power, not in a fortress, not in conquered provinces, not in armies, in ideas. And that may have been the most important transformation of all, because while Sweden was still arguing about how to recover its old greatness, some Swedes were quietly beginning to imagine a completely different definition of greatness. So while they were arguing about war, something great was happening in Sweden, something quieter, less dramatic, and in the long run, possibly more important. People were beginning to ask different questions. Not, how did we conquer this? But how does this work? How does a plant grow? How does the human body work? How do you measure temperature? What causes disease? What can be done with the resources Sweden already has? Those questions might not sound revolutionary, but they belong to a much larger movement sweeping across 18th century Europe, the Enlightenment. The idea that the world wasn't simply something you inherited and accepted. It was something you could investigate, measure, question, and perhaps improve. And Sweden got very interested in that idea. In 1739, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences was founded. Its purpose was practical as much as intellectual. It brought together people interested in science, agriculture, engineering, economics, and the natural world. And that tells us something about where Sweden was beginning to look for its future. The country couldn't simply manufacture another empire, but perhaps it could become extraordinarily good at understanding the country it already had. One of the people who came to represent this new intellectual Sweden was Carl Linnaeus. And Linnaeus had a rather unusual obsession. He wanted to organize the natural world, plants, animals, everything he could find. He traveled through Sweden, recording what he saw, and he didn't simply look at landscape and admire it. He wanted to understand it. What grew there? What could be cultivated? What could be used? What was different from what he'd seen somewhere else? To us, Linnaeus' system of classification can seem like something belonging in a biology textbook. But imagine the world before all of this was standardized. A plant might have several local names. Different scholars might use different terms. Someone could describe the same species differently depending on where they lived. Linnaeus wanted order. He wanted a system. And his work would eventually influence how much the natural world was classified. And then there was Anders Celsius. His name is probably more familiar to you than Linnaeus. You've certainly used his invention, or at least the scale that carries his name. Celsius was interested in astronomy and measurement, and he helped establish an observatory in Uppsala. He studied the Earth's shape, he studied the northern lights, and he developed a temperature scale that would eventually become the Celsius scale used around much of the world. Think about the contrast. A generation earlier, Sweden had been trying to measure its greatness by territory that it controlled. Now, one of its scientists was trying to measure temperature. And that might sound like a ridiculous comparison, but it isn't, because measurement is power too. If you can measure something accurately, you can compare it. If you can compare it, you can study it. And if you can study it, you can begin to change it. That was the promise of the Enlightenment. Knowledge wasn't simply something interesting to possess. It could be useful. It could improve agriculture, it could improve navigation, it could improve medicine, and it could help industries become more productive. It can make a country richer without requiring it to conquer another country. And that was a very different way of thinking about national strength. You didn't need another province. Maybe you needed a better crop. You didn't need another fortress. Maybe you needed better engineering. You didn't need another battlefield victory. Maybe you needed someone to discover something nobody had understood before. And this is where I think Sweden's story becomes really interesting, because the Age of Liberty wasn't simply a political experiment. It was also creating an environment in which ideas could compete. People could debate. Researchers could investigate. Entrepreneurs could experiment. And the country was beginning to build institutions around knowledge. It wouldn't happen overnight, and certainly not everyone had access to this new intellectual world. Sweden was still unequal. It was still politically divided, and it was still capable of making some spectacularly bad decisions. But beneath it all, something was changing. The country was beginning to discover that it could matter without dominating. It could contribute without conquering, become influential without becoming an empire. And perhaps that is the most important thing that happened after the empire disappeared. Sweden didn't simply learn how to live with losing. It began discovering things it might never have discovered if it had remained obsessed with getting everything back. But political experiments have a problem. Eventually, people start fighting over who gets to control them, and the Age of Liberty was no exception, because the same system that had given Sweden debate had also given its political faction something else: power. And by the time Gustav III came along, the argument was no longer simply about what Sweden should become. It was about whether the experiment itself could survive. Freedom has a weakness. It requires people to actually use it responsibly. The Age of Liberty had given Sweden something remarkable. The king had limits. The Riksdag had power. Political factions could argue openly, and ideas could compete. But eventually, the competition became less about ideas and more about winning. The hats and the caps weren't simply debating Sweden's future anymore. They were fighting for control of the government. And once political power becomes the prize, compromise gets harder. Every election matters more. Every defeat becomes harder to accept. Every victory becomes something you have to protect. And there was another problem. Sweden wasn't the only country interested in what was happening inside the Riksdag. France wanted influence, Russia wanted influence, and both understood something that Swedish politicians were beginning to learn the hard way. You didn't necessarily have to defeat Sweden on a battlefield. You could influence the people making its decisions. Foreign money began flowing into Swedish politics. Foreign governments supported factions they believed would advance their interests. And suddenly, the great Swedish experiment in self-government had a rather uncomfortable complication. Sweden was governing itself, but other countries were trying to influence how it did so. Imagine being a Swedish politician at this point. You believe you're fighting for the future of your country, and you're convinced that the other faction is leading Sweden in the wrong direction, and then there's money from a foreign power sitting on the table. How much of your decision is actually yours? That's the problem with political systems. They don't have to collapse completely to stop working well, because sometimes they simply become exhausting. Debates drag on, decisions become harder, factions become more interested in defeating one another than solving problems. And eventually, people outside the political class began looking at the whole thing and wondering, is this actually working? That question matters, because the promise of the Age of Liberty had been that Sweden could govern itself better without concentrating power in one person. But what happens when the people sharing that power can't agree? What happens when parliament becomes so divided that government begins to look weak? And what happens when people become tired of watching politicians argue? That's when something dangerous can happen. People begin to want someone who can simply make a decision, someone who can walk into a room and end an argument, someone who can say, enough, I'll handle it. And Sweden had exactly the kind of person waiting in the wings. His name was Gustav. He was young, charismatic, cultured, and unlike the politicians fighting inside the Riksdag, he understood something about power. People don't always want to participate in governing. Sometimes they just want someone to govern, and Gustav had grown up watching the monarchy struggle against the Riksdag. He admired the Enlightenment. He admired French culture. He believed strongly in reform, but he also believed Sweden needed a stronger executive power. And perhaps, most importantly, he understood how to perform. That might sound like an odd quality for a king, but Gustav III understood something that other politicians didn't. Politics isn't only about institutions, it's about people. And people respond to stories. They respond to charisma, they respond to confidence, and Gustav knew how to give them all three. By 1772, the political system had reached a breaking point. The factions were divided, foreign influence was widespread, the government was struggling to function, and Gustav decided the moment had arrived. He didn't wait for the Riksdag to give him more power, he took it. In August 1772, Gustav's supporters secured key positions in Stockholm. Government leaders were arrested, the king presented a new constitution to the Riksdag, and remarkably, almost no blood was shed. The Age of Liberty had lasted a little over 50 years, and now it was over, at least in the form Sweden had known it. Because here's the question that makes this ending much more complicated. Did Gustav prove that the experiment had failed? Or did the experiment prove something else? That even when a political system disappears, the ideas it created don't necessarily disappear with it. Because Sweden has spent 50 years learning something it could never completely unlearn, that kings could be challenged, that governments could be debated, that power could be divided, and that a country didn't have to measure its greatness by the number of territories it controlled. Gustav could take power, he could change the constitution, he could restore royal authority, but he couldn't make the last 50 years unhappen. And that's where our story becomes much more interesting than a simple tale of a king taking back his throne. So, did it work? Did Sweden actually reinvent itself? The monarchy came back stronger. The political factions became more bitter and divided. Foreign powers had interfered in Swedish politics. The Hats had dragged Sweden into another disastrous war, and eventually Gustav III walked into Stockholm and took back much of the power that Parliament had spent 50 years accumulating. If you were sitting in the Riksdag in 1772, you might have looked at all of this and thought, well, that didn't work. But history has a funny way of making that question more complicated, because political systems can fail without their ideas failing with them. The Age of Liberty didn't create a modern Sweden overnight. It wasn't democracy as we understand it. It wasn't equal. It wasn't always peaceful. And it certainly wasn't free from corruption or political manipulation. But it did something that may have been more important than creating a perfect system. It gave Sweden experience. Experience with parliament, experience with political parties, experience with debate, experience with limiting royal power, and experience with the uncomfortable idea that a king could be told no. And once a country has spent 50 years learning how to argue about who should have power, you can't simply erase that experience. Gustav III could change the constitution, he could strengthen the monarchy, and he could take control of the government, but he couldn't make Sweden forget what it had already learned. And perhaps that is the strange thing about political history. Sometimes the most important changes aren't the ones that last forever. Sometimes they're the ones that change what people believe is possible. And look at where Sweden had ended up a century earlier. Swedish greatness had been measured in territory, armies, fortresses, battles, kings. Now, there were scientists studying the natural world. There were institutions dedicated to knowledge. There were political debates happening inside the Riksdag. There were people beginning to imagine national strength in terms of trade, science, education, and innovation. The country hadn't become peaceful forever. It hadn't become democratic. It hadn't suddenly become the Sweden we recognize today, but the direction had changed, and that matters. Because Sweden had learned something that Charles XII never had the opportunity to learn. Losing an empire didn't have to mean losing the country. That distinction is enormous. Sweden had lost territory, and it had lost influence, and it had lost lives. It had lost the identity of being that great military power. But it hadn't lost the ability to become something else. And that is the real story of the Age of Liberty. Not that Sweden successfully built the perfect political system. It didn't. Not that Sweden suddenly abandoned war. It didn't. And not that everyone agreed about what Sweden should become. They certainly didn't. The remarkable thing is that Sweden kept experimenting. It kept changing. It kept arguing. And eventually, those experiments would become part of a much larger transformation. The empire was gone, but Sweden wasn't. And I think that's worth remembering when we look at history. We tend to think of countries as permanent things, as though Sweden in 1721 was simply the same Sweden that exists today, just with different clothes. It wasn't. Countries change, their borders change, their governments change. Their economies change, and perhaps their ideas about themselves change. Sweden had once believed that greatness meant expansion. Then it discovered that survival might require restraint, and it tried to recover its old greatness through war and discovered that the old world was gone. And slowly, almost accidentally, it began building a different kind of country. Not one based in how much territory it controlled, but one that could create with the territory it had. That transformation would take generations, and it would not be smooth, and there would be another king, another war, another enormous national trauma. In fact, the next great loss would be one that Sweden would feel in a different way, because in 1809, Sweden would lose Finland, and that's the story we'll go to next. But before we leave the Age of Liberty, I want to go back to the question we started with. Can a nation reinvent itself after losing an empire? I think Sweden gives us a surprisingly complicated answer. Yes, but not by pretending the loss never happened, and not by endlessly trying to reclaim the past, and not by finding another king who promises to make the country great again. Sometimes reinvention means accepting the world you knew is gone and then asking, what you can build with what remains. Sweden lost its empire. It lost wars, it lost political experiments, and it made terrible decisions. And it made some remarkably good ones. And somewhere in all of that, it began becoming something new. Maybe the greatest victory isn't always the one where you get back what you lost. Maybe sometimes it's discovering that you don't need it anymore. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Beyond the Swedish Postcard. If you've enjoyed the story, please take a moment to follow the podcast so you don't miss the next episode. And if you think someone else would enjoy this story, share the episode with them. Word of mouth really does help a small independent podcast find new listeners. And if you've been enjoying this series, I'd love to hear what you think. Because next time, we're going to look at one of the most painful turning points in Swedish history, the loss of Finland. What happens when a country doesn't just lose an empire, but loses a part of itself? Until then, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard. Tack så mycket för att ni lyssnat. Hej då för now.